check this out. A Pew Research study really says how Americans feel about race relations in the country. And that is, when it comes to Donald Trump, very negative. 6 in 10 Americans, that's almost 60%, say race relations in the U.S. are bad. And of those, they few see improving. Some 56% think Donald Trump has made race relations worse. Just 15% says he has improved race relations. And another 13% say he has tried but failed to make progress on this issue. Roughly 2/3 say it's become more common for people to express racist views since Donald Trump became president. Joining us right now is research associate with Pew, who headed the study, Dr. Kiana Cox. Doc, how you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me, Roland.
All right, so let's unpack this. First of all, a lot of black people always say, I ain't never got called, so I don't trust these surveys. I've gotten called a number of times. So can you speak to that first of all? How did you actually conduct this study?
Sure. So at the Pew Research Center, we have something known as our American Trends Panel. And we work really hard at the center to make sure that we recruit a nationally representative panel that we actually maintain and keep in contact with. And for example, if you're somebody who doesn't have the internet, a lot of our polling is online. We'll provide you with internet and a tablet. And so we really work hard to make sure that we can get a nationally representative sample, along with making sure that people actually have access to be able to take our surveys. So these are rigorous methods, a nationally representative sample that we keep in constant contact with, and a panel that we actually maintain.
All right, so let's unpack in terms of what this study revealed in terms of how folks feel. Was there a difference between when Obama was president and Trump becomes president?
Absolutely. So what we see in our studies, and both of these questions were asked at the beginning of 2019. So just for some contrast, this isn't old versus new data, right? So what we see now is that as you mentioned earlier, about 60% of Americans say that since his election, Donald Trump has made race relations worse. As compared to Barack Obama, where only 25% of Americans said that Obama made race relations worse.
So 56% say Donald Trump has made it worse versus 25% who say Obama has made it worse.
Yes, and these were both studies conducted at the beginning of 2019.
Do you break down Democrat, Republican, or is it just Americans? And if so, how does that break down?
We break down. So one of the things that we found across this study is that, in general, African Americans tend to stand out as in terms of broad majority, saying that Donald Trump has said things that has made race worse. And also, a majority of whites say this too. But what's interesting is that when whites are Democrats and when they have bachelor's degrees, their views tend to align even more with blacks.
So for lack of a better phrase, smarter white folks versus the white folks with just a high school diploma.
Whites with bachelor's degrees.
Smarter white people. So that's just that's how I break the data down. That's how I break the data down. And that's important because when you look at who Donald Trump is really speaking to, he's speaking to that non-college audience. And when we talk about those numbers, what does it look like? I mean, how stark is it?
So, for example, generally when we look at sort of partisan splits, especially among whites, when it comes to a lot of these racial attitudes, speaking broadly, we tend to see a 60-40 split. So around 60% of white Democrats will lean more towards the patterns that we see for African Americans, whereas 40% or less of white Republicans would lean towards the opposite opinion. Now, again, that's a broad swath of these. For certain areas, those percentages are actually even more stark when we look at different areas.
What about Latinos?
Latinos are interesting because when it comes to issues of racial discrimination, Latinos fall more in line with African Americans. But if you ask Latinos, for example, has being Latino helped or hurt your ability to get ahead in the United States, 44% of them will say neither one. Being Latino hasn't helped or hurt me.
But the other difference that people also don't understand is you have white Hispanics and non-white Hispanics.
Right, right. And so It's interesting. In our surveys, we allow people to self-identify
Right.
in terms of race, and so if Hispanics are also identify as white, they'll still be counted in our survey as Hispanic. So we haven't been able just yet to unpack sort of white versus black Hispanic.
It's very interesting, again, when you look at the data in terms of this. Trump loves talking about polls. This is one he never wants to talk about. And are there any specific things that have happened that people have said, this is why I feel that way? Charlottesville or anything else?
Well, we didn't specifically ask about particular events, but sort of the touchstone that we asked about was, since Donald Trump has been elected, what are these things? So we mentioned earlier, since he's been elected, a majority of Americans feel that race relations have gotten worse. Since he's been elected, a majority of Americans also feel that it's more acceptable to say racist things openly and publicly. And then a little less than half of Americans also say that it's more common to say these things. So we didn't ask about specific events like Charlottesville or any of the Black Lives Matter protests, etc., but we did sort of peg this from the beginning of his election up until the point that they took the survey, and that's what they were assessing.
Dr. Greg Carr, Chair, Department of Afro-American Studies, Howard University. You got a question?
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations, Dr. Cox.
Thank you.
Great report. You know, something I read near the end, and we'll be using this certainly in the fall when school starts again, this question of people identifying with their race. One of the subtexts in your study really really emphasized the invisibility of whiteness. How white folks really don't see how their race, they see how their race plays, but when they identify it, very few, it seemed to me, I would have expected, very few white people said, you know, I identify strongly as white. How do you read that?
I think, well, what we have, so there are shares of, so one of the things that's really interesting when we ask about racial identity importance in our data is that across the board, a lot of our measures strengthen when we take into account racial identity, even for whites. So even if there's a smaller share of whites than comparatively blacks or Hispanics, once you take into account racial identity, for whites, we see sort of ideas about discrimination strengthen, ideas about sort of the state of the country strengthen. So though racial identity, education, and partisanship or party, all of those things tend to play into sort of disparities among whites. So it's interesting because last week I did a piece on linked fate, which was the extent to which people feel as if, I feel like you heard that term before.
Yes.
Which is the extent to which people feel as if what happens to other races will impact their lives. And one of the things that we see in that study, again, is that when you have whites who have bachelor's degrees and who are Democrats, their linked fate, or the extent to which they feel like people of color, what happens to them will impact them, increases.
Interesting.
Wow. Kiana Cox, Pew, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.